Close your eyes for a second and think about the word hell. What do you see? If you grew up in the Western world, the images materialize instantly. Caverns of unquenchable fire, rivers of boiling brimstone, a subterranean torture chamber where souls writhe in eternal, conscious agony while a wrathful God looks down from above. It is the terrifying backdrop of medieval art, the fuel of fire and brimstone sermons, and the ultimate threat that has shaped millions for centuries. We have been taught that this burning abyss is the absolute centerpiece of divine justice. We treat it as gospel truth. But there is a staggering, uncomfortable problem with this picture. If you stepped back in time to 1st century Judea and showed that exact image to the Jewish rabbi from Nazareth, he wouldn't recognize it. That subterranean chamber of eternal torture wasn't born in the Hebrew scriptures. It wasn't preached by the Old Testament prophets. And most shockingly of all, it was never what Jesus was talking about. What if our modern view of hell came from medieval poetry and pagan mythology rather than the actual words of Christ? What if the warning Jesus issued was infinitely more urgent, deeply historical, and far more terrifyingly real than an underground fire? To understand what Jesus actually said, we have to strip away 2,000 years of cultural translation. We have to look at a physical map, and we have to step into a valley that still exists today. To understand how we got this so terribly wrong, we have to look at the tragic limitations of the English language. When you open a modern English Bible and read the word hell, you are not looking at a single, unified concept from the ancient world. You are actually looking at a blanket translation that covers 4 completely different words from ancient Hebrew and Greek. And by lumping these distinct words together into one terrifying English term, translators accidentally buried the deepest theological truths of the scriptures. Let's start at the beginning. In the Old Testament, the ancient Hebrews did not have a concept of an underworld fire where bad people went to burn for eternity. Their word for the realm of the dead was Sheol. Sheol was not a place of torture. It was simply the grave, the shadowy, silent pit where all physical life ends. Good people went to Sheol. Bad people went to Sheol. It was the common destination of mortal humanity, a place of stillness, darkness, and returning to dust. When the Hebrew scriptures were later translated into Greek, centuries before Christ, scholars used the Greek word Hades to represent Sheol. Again, to a 1st century Jew, Hades simply meant the realm of the dead, not a fiery torture chamber. Then there is Tartarus, a Greek term borrowed from pagan mythology, used only once in the entire New Testament by the Apostle Peter to describe a temporary holding prison for rebellious angels, never for human beings. Which brings us directly to Jesus of Nazareth. When Jesus warned his audiences about divine judgment, he didn't use Sheol, and he rarely used Hades. Instead, he used a specific, deliberate word 12 distinct times in the Gospels. That word is Gehenna. And here is the paradigm-shifting linguistic unlock. Gehenna is not an invisible spiritual realm in the afterlife. Gehenna is a GPS coordinate. It is a real, physical location on the map of ancient Israel. The word Gehenna is the Greek transliteration of the Hebrew Hinnom, which translates literally to the Valley of the Son of Hinnom. If you were to buy a plane ticket to Tel Aviv today, take a taxi up into the hills of Jerusalem, and walk just a few hundred yards outside the southwestern stone walls of the old city, you would be standing right in the middle of Gehenna. You can literally walk through it, touch the dirt, sit under the olive trees, and feel the dry wind blowing across the landscape. Why would Jesus use a literal valley outside Jerusalem as his primary symbol for divine judgment and destruction? Because to a 1st century Jewish audience, steeped in their own history, the Valley of Hinnom was the darkest, most blood-soaked location in their entire national memory. Hundreds of years before Jesus walked the earth, during the reigns of wicked kings like Ahaz and Manasseh, Israel abandoned Yahweh and turned to the worship of a Canaanite god named Molech. And the worship of Molech required an unthinkable, horrifying sacrifice: human infants. Right there, in the Valley of Hinnom, Israelites built towering bronze altars with outstretched arms, heated them from below with raging fires, and placed their own living children into the flames to secure political and economic prosperity. It was the absolute epicenter of human evil. It was where Israel sacrificed its own future on the altar of greed and false gods. The righteous King Josiah later rose to power and destroyed these high places. He defiled the Valley of Hinnom so that no Jew would ever use it for worship again. Over the centuries that followed, this once sacred valley became the city's official garbage dump. It was where the filth of Jerusalem was discarded, raw sewage, the carcasses of dead animals, and the unburied bodies of executed criminals. To prevent rampant disease, sulfur fires were kept burning day and night to consume the decay. Maggots and worms continually fed on the rot that the fire didn't reach. When Jesus spoke of Gehenna, where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched, he was not inventing a new theology of eternal torture. He was pointing his finger directly toward a smoking, burning landfill just outside their city walls, a place that symbolized the ultimate destruction of human dignity, idolatry, and national ruin. He wasn't talking about where God sends bad souls after they die. He was holding up a mirror to the historical, real-world consequences of rejecting the way of life. If realizing that Gehenna is a real, physical valley on a map is shifting how you read the Bible right now, you're not alone. We are on a mission to uncover these lost truths together. Hit subscribe and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Even dropping one thought in the comments helps this conversation reach more people. Let's dive deeper into what Jesus was actually warning his generation about. To grasp the absolute weight of Jesus' warning, we have to recognize a stunning biblical pattern that connects the Old Testament prophets directly to the gospel narratives. Because Jesus wasn't the first prophet to stand before Jerusalem, point his finger toward the Valley of Hinnom, and warn of catastrophic judgment. Turn the clock back 600 years before Christ. The prophet Jeremiah stands overlooking this exact same valley during the final days of the First Temple period. The nation is steeped in corruption, idolatry is rampant, and the smoke of human sacrifice rises daily. Jeremiah lifts his voice and delivers a prophecy. Because Israel has forsaken justice to build high places in the Valley of Hinnom, this valley will no longer be called Topheth or Hinnom. It will be called the Valley of Slaughter. Why? Because when the Babylonian Empire invades Jerusalem, the destruction will be so absolute that the dead bodies will be piled high in this valley simply because there is nowhere else left to bury them. Notice the pattern carefully. For Jeremiah, Gehenna wasn't a threat of post-mortem spiritual torture in a dungeon. It was a prophecy of imminent, historical destruction, the physical consequence of a nation choosing violence over peace. In 586 BC, that prophecy came true. Babylon breached the walls, leveled the temple, and slaughtered the people. The Valley of Hinnom became an open graveyard. Now, fast forward 6 centuries. Jesus arrives on the scene, walking the dusty roads of Judea, surrounded by a volatile society, groaning under the Roman Empire. The air is thick with rebellion. Revolutionary movements, especially the Zealots, are plotting violent insurrections against Rome. They believe the only way to establish God's kingdom is through bloodshed. They want a military messiah to lead them into battle. Right into this explosive powder keg steps Jesus of Nazareth, preaching a counter-cultural message that threatens to upend everything. Love your enemies, turn the other cheek, put away your sword, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Whenever Jesus warns his audience about Gehenna, whether in the Sermon on the Mount or his rebukes to the religious elite, he is doing the exact same thing Jeremiah did 600 years earlier. He is functioning as Israel's final, culminating prophet. Listen to his most famous warning with new ears. When Jesus says, "If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into Gehenna," he is using brilliant hyperbole to make an urgent point to his generation. He is looking at a nation sprinting toward violent rebellion against Rome, and he is pleading with them, "Stop. Turn around, abandon your destructive path. It is better to strip away your pride, your political ambitions, your desire for revenge, and your weapons of war than to see your entire nation, your temple, and your bodies thrown into the burning garbage dump of Hinnom. Jesus wasn't threatening them with an angry God who would torture their souls in the afterlife if they didn't pray the right sinner's prayer. He was weeping over them, warning them about the natural, unavoidable, historical end of their own violent trajectory. And tragic history proves he was right. They ignored the warning. They chose the sword. In the year 70 AD, just one generation after Jesus uttered these warnings, the Zealots triggered their rebellion against Rome. General Titus marched on Jerusalem with 4 legions. They surrounded the city during Passover, trapping millions inside. Starvation set in. Finally, the Romans breached the walls, slaughtered the inhabitants without mercy, and burned the second temple to the ground, until not one stone was left standing. The first-century Jewish historian Josephus, an eyewitness to the siege, records details of the destruction so horrific they chill the blood. He writes that the slaughter inside the city was so immense and the dead bodies so overwhelming that Roman soldiers literally picked up hundreds of thousands of Jewish corpses and threw them over the city walls. And where did those bodies land? They landed at the bottom of the Valley of Hinnom. They landed in Gehenna. Once again, just as Jeremiah predicted, and just as Jesus warned, the valley became an open, smoking graveyard. The sulfur fires burned day and night to consume the rotting flesh of a nation that refused the way of peace. The worms did not die until the carcasses were consumed. The fire was not quenched until there was nothing left to burn. This is the climax of what Jesus actually said. When we snap all these historical puzzle pieces together, the paradigm shifts entirely. The ultimate tragedy of hell is not that God created a torture chamber to punish human beings for breaking divine rules. The tragedy is that God granted humanity the freedom to choose our own paths, and when we choose violence, oppression, and rebellion against His love, those paths naturally terminate in Gehenna. Hell is not a torture chamber designed by an angry God. It is a slaughterhouse engineered by human hands. When Jesus spoke of hell, He wasn't offering a geography lesson of the afterlife. He was giving a desperately loving, prophetic warning about the reality of human choice. Look at the pattern across all of human history. When humanity rejects self-giving love, we choose self-destruction. When we choose greed over generosity, we create economic devastation. When we choose empire over community, we create war. God doesn't push us into the flames. We light the match. We build the altars. We walk into the burning valley ourselves. Jesus didn't come to earth to condemn the world to Gehenna. He stepped right into the line of fire, weeping over Jerusalem, begging His children to drop their weapons and walk away from the edge of the abyss. Let's leave first-century Jerusalem behind for a moment. Let's step away from the historical maps, the Roman legions, and the ancient prophecies, and bring this truth all the way home to where you are sitting right now. Because while Gehenna is a physical valley in the Middle East, and while Jesus' primary warning was directed at the historical destruction of an ancient city, there is a profound, deeply personal reason why His words still shake us to our core today. We know what it feels like to live in Gehenna. We might not be building towering bronze altars in a physical valley, but how often do we sacrifice what is deeply precious on the altars of modern life? Think about it. How many times have we sacrificed our peace of mind, our emotional health, or our relationships with the people we love most, just to feed the relentless, demanding gods of ambition, financial success, and social validation? How many of us are trapped in our own private valleys of Hinnom right now? Maybe your Gehenna is a cycle of addiction that burns away your self-worth day after day, a fire that never seems to go out, no matter how hard you try to quench it, leaving you feeling like a prisoner in your own skin. Maybe your Gehenna is an unhealed trauma, a burning resentment towards someone who betrayed you years ago, It's a bitterness that eats away at your joy like a worm that never dies, silently consuming your vitality from the inside out while the person who hurt you has long moved on. Or maybe it is the suffocating, silent isolation of anxiety and depression. That feeling of being trapped behind walls of your own construction, watching your dreams slowly turn into ash, convinced that you are broken beyond repair and too ashamed to reach out for help. If you are sitting in the smoke of any of those valleys today, I want to slow down, look you in the eye, and tell you something terribly important. Your pain makes complete sense. It is not crazy that you feel exhausted. It is not a moral failure that you feel overwhelmed by the destructive loops in your life. We live in a fractured world that constantly entices us to choose competition over compassion, ego over empathy, and isolation over vulnerability. From the moment we are born, society trains us to walk right into the valleys of burnout and self-destruction. We are told that if we just hustle hard enough, the fire won't burn us. We are told that vulnerability is weakness and that forgiveness is for losers. Validate the weight of what you are carrying right now. It is heavy, and the fire is real. But here is the breathtaking, transformational payoff of understanding what Jesus actually meant when he spoke about hell. If hell is not an inescapable, eternal torture chamber locked by a wrathful God in the sky, but rather the self-destructive valleys we wander into when we lose our way, then that means everything changes about how God sees you in your pain. It means God is not standing at the gates of your suffering with a pitchfork, waiting to lock you in because you made a mistake. He is the rescuer running into the valley to pull you out. Think about where Jesus spent his final hours. When he was crucified, he wasn't executed inside the clean, comfortable precincts of the temple. He was taken outside the city walls. He was hung on a Roman cross, overlooking the very valleys of rejection and death he had warned his people about. Jesus, physically, willingly, descended into the filth, the shame, and the violence of human sin. He stepped right into the middle of our Gehenna, so that we would never have to stay there alone. The gospel is not a golden ticket to avoid a post-mortem fire while we continue to destroy ourselves and the people around us in the present. The gospel is the liberating announcement that the gates of your personal Gehenna are not locked from the outside. The rescue mission has already begun. Right now, in the middle of your anxiety, in the middle of your broken relationship, in the middle of your addiction or your paralyzing fear, Jesus is standing in the smoke. He is holding out a nail-scarred hand, offering you a radically different way to live, a way of forgiveness that extinguishes the fires of bitterness, a way of authentic community that tears down the isolation of shame, a way of grace that washes away the filth of your past and restores your human dignity. You don't have to burn in the valleys of your own making anymore. You don't have to let the fire consume another day of your peace. You can take his hand, you can step out of the smoke, and you can begin to walk toward the healing, restorative light of his kingdom today. Here is the truth I want you to carry with you as you step back into your life today. God is not the architect of your destruction. He is the author of your resurrection. Hell is what happens when we let go of his hand, but grace is his hand reaching into our darkest valleys to bring us home. If this message opened your eyes and brought you peace today, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone struggling in their own valley right now. Leave a comment below telling us where you are finding hope this week. Your words might be the exact spark someone else needs in the dark. Thank you for walking this journey with us. Keep us in your prayers as we keep you in ours. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.